Hello, I am Santiago Rodas. I am the Program and Policy Officer of Nutrition at the World Food Program Latin American and Caribbean Regional Office. I'm happy to present our proposal to streamline large-scale food fortification enforcement and evaluation systems in the region. Today, we are going to focus on the enforcement system, but I will also give you a sense of how we propose to evaluate the impact of large-scale food fortification programs in the future. In this presentation, I will address the following topics: micronutrient deficiencies in Latin America and the Caribbean, large-scale food fortification in the region, main challenges of enforcement and evaluation systems, and about the WFP proposal to streamline large-scale food fortification enforcement and evaluation systems. Let's begin with a quick overview of the micronutrient deficiencies in Latin America and the Caribbean. Micronutrient malnutrition caused by a deficiency of one or more essential vitamins and minerals is widely prevalent in the region and worldwide. It is significantly associated with the global burden of poverty and disease, and therefore it disproportionately affects marginalized low-income communities. Iron, B vitamins such as folic acid, vitamin A, zinc, and in some contexts, iodine are the most prevalent micronutrient deficiencies. Micronutrient malnutrition, as we know, contributes to poor growth, intellectual impairments, perinatal complications, and increased risk of morbidity and mortality. We've been also observing emerging concerns about deficiencies in vitamins D and E intake in the region. Deficiencies of these two vitamins are posing additional public health challenges in Latin America and the Caribbean. Micronutrient deficiencies affects primarily women of reproductive age and young children. This is largely because their bodies have higher physiological demands, especially during pregnancy, lactation, and early childhood. However, in many cases, their diets are made up mostly of staple foods like rice, maize, or wheat. Those foods don't provide enough essential vitamins and minerals to meet their physiological requirements. That's where fortification comes in. By adding key micronutrients to widely consumed staple foods, we have the opportunity to reach these groups at risk and help close nutrient gaps in a sustainable and cost-effective way. Therefore, one strategic solution to address micronutrient deficiencies in the region is large-scale food fortification, also known as LSFF. Large-scale food fortification is not a new initiative. It has safely and effectively contributed to preventing micronutrient deficiencies in high-income countries for over 100 years. With the right policies in place, a robust design, and adequate enforcement and evaluation systems, large-scale food purification could have a similar success in Latin America and the Caribbean. Evidence shows that when adequately implemented and designed, large-scale food fortification programs help ensure that vulnerable groups such as women and young children receive the nutrients they need. Although there is significant potential to implement large-scale food fortification in the region, not all programs have achieved success. In fact, only a few have demonstrated measurable impact, typically those with strong enforcement and evaluation systems in place. An effective enforcement system ensures that the food industry complies with fortification standards. In other words, it helps assessing whether the industry is adding the quantities of micronutrients determined by law to the foods they produce. It also helps create a level playing field, ensuring that all companies operate under the same conditions. Similarly, a robust evaluation system is essential for assessing the extent to which large-scale food fortification contributes to improving micronutrient intake, particularly among the vulnerable groups. As we'll see in the coming slides, most large-scale food fortification programs in the region need to strengthen their enforcement and evaluation systems. Now let me show you this classic figure on the right. This will help us better understand the fortification landscape. Here we see different types of fortification. Our focus is on mandatory large-scale food fortification, which is legally required, widely implemented, and is capable of reaching large segments of the population. In the lower right corner, you'll see a cross. This cross highlights two essential pillars of large-scale food fortification programs. Compliance, which as we discussed, helps to assess the extent to which the food industries are complying with the fortification standards, and coverage, which refers to the proportion of the population consuming the fortified foods. When assessing coverage, we also need to estimate the consumption patterns of the fortified foods in the population. This is to understand how much of the fortified foods people are actually eating. Data on compliance, coverage, and consumption of fortified foods can allow us to estimate the contribution of fortified food consumption of specific micronutrients or to micronutrient intake. Unfortunately, in many countries across the region, these systems are still underdeveloped. That's precisely why we are working on this topic, to help governments fill these data gaps. Now let's have a closer look to the main challenges of enforcement and evaluation systems in the region. In 2022, the World Food Programme, in partnership with the Nutrition Institute of Central America and Panama, known as INCAP by its Spanish acronym, conducted an assessment on the state of enforcement systems in 6 countries. This assessment was carried out in Panama, Nicaragua, El Salvador, Honduras, Guatemala, and the Dominican Republic. The study identified 4 major challenges related to enforcement systems across the countries. First, there is a lack of established and consistent quality assurance and quality control practices both within the food industry and among government agencies. Second, the sampling designs used for quality control require a large number of food samples, making the process resource intensive. Third, government face limitations in technical expertise and financial resources, which hinders their ability to conduct inspections and audits effectively. And fourth, there is limited laboratory testing capacity, the use of unnecessary complex methodologies, and high testing costs. The main takeaway from this assessment is that current enforcement systems need to be optimized to ensure they can be effectively implemented. Let's have now a more in-depth look at the data landscape. And let's start with SALT, the most successful fortification vehicle. The data I'm about to present were obtained from the Global Fortification Data Exchange. This exploration was conducted in late April 2025 and covers a search period from 2010 to 2020. The search focused exclusively on low, middle, and upper middle income countries in the Americas. Therefore, only countries in Latin America and the Caribbean were considered. When reviewing data on iodized salt coverage, I found that only 5 countries in the region have available information. 3 of these are in South America: Paraguay, Peru, and Bolivia. As shown in the table, the data from Peru and Bolivia are the most recent, and in all cases, coverage levels are relatively high. In Central America, data were only available for Belize, and in the Caribbean, only Haiti had accessible information. What stands out in Haiti is the low coverage of iodized salt. Just 7.5% of the population has access to fortified salt. This figure points to poor performance of the fortification program, which could place the population at a high risk of iodine deficiency. Let's now take a look at the data on compliance with salt fortification standards. This exploration covered the search period from 2010 to 2021. We observed that fewer countries have available data, and that these data are even more outdated than the coverage data. In South America, only Peru and Colombia have information on compliance with salt fortification. However, only Peru provides detailed data, including average fortification levels as well as a minimum and a maximum value. Colombia reports compliance by observing the proportion of commercially available fortified salt using results from qualitative or quantitative tests, but does not report actual fortification levels. Even when quantitative tests are used, quality reports are limited to indicating the proportion of fortified products without specifying fortification levels or whether they meet the standards established by law. Additionally, without information on the average iodine concentration, it is not possible to objectively estimate the contribution of salt intake to iodine intake. Although standards can be used to make an estimate, it would be preferable to have a more objective measurement in order to assess the program's impact on iodine intake. In the table, we can see that in Peru, less than 60% of industries comply with fortification standards. We may infer that if Colombia were to use minimum and maximum values to assess compliance with standards, the reported compliance rate would likely be lower. In Central America and the Caribbean, information on compliance with salt fortification standards is more recent. However, only 3 countries have available data: Mexico, Costa Rica, and Haiti. Similar to Colombia, evaluations in these countries are based on qualitative or quantitative testing at a commercial level, not specify whether the industry is actually meeting fortification standards. Additionally, it's important to note that, with the exception of Costa Rica, the data from the other countries are based on expert opinion rather than a formal established external quality control system for fortified foods. Let's now take a look at the data landscape for wheat flour, another commonly fortified food vehicle in the region. When it comes to wheat flour, only data on compliance with fortification standards are available. There is no accessible information on the coverage of fortified wheat flour. 7 countries in South America have data on compliance with wheat flour fortification: Argentina, Paraguay, Brazil, Peru, Ecuador, Colombia, and Venezuela. However, only Peru and Brazil report quantitative data based on samples collected directly from the mills. The remaining countries rely on indirect indicators of fortification quality using samples collected at the market level and base their assessment on expert opinion rather than on official reports from food control authorities. As with the data on salt fortification compliance, quality control may be conducted using qualitative or quantitative tests that reports do not indicate whether the industry is meeting the fortification standards established by law. In Central America and the Caribbean, data on compliance with flour fortification is available for 8 countries: Costa Rica, Honduras, El Salvador, Belize, Guatemala, Mexico, Haiti, and the Dominican Republic. With the exception of Costa Rica and Mexico, the data comes from expert opinions. The available data only confirms that flour is fortified without providing details on fortification levels or the degree of compliance with established standards. As you can see, the way fortification compliance is reported across the region is inconsistent, and so is the interpretation of the data. It would be ideal to have a more standardized approach to reporting, with monitoring focused on quantitative testing that objectively measures fortification levels. This would allow us to determine the extent to which industries are meeting fortification standards. To finalize this section, I would like to give you some takeaway messages. The enforcement systems need to be strengthened to effectively monitor compliance of the industry with fortification standards in the region. The lack of adequate and consistent evaluation processes leads to uncertainty about the impact of large-scale food fortification programs for most countries. Overall, there are no updated data on fortification levels, coverage of fortified foods, and consumption estimates, and there are no robust data on the contribution of fortified food consumption to micronutrient intake. So we need to strengthen and in some cases build enforcement and evaluation systems to effectively assess whether fortification programs are contributing to improving micronutrient intake and to understand the magnitude of that contribution. So after reviewing the context, I will now focus on the WFP proposal to streamline large-scale food fortification, enforcement, and evaluation systems in the region. Based on the challenges discussed in the previous section, we propose to develop a cost-effective enforcement system based on 5 indicators. These indicators focus on monitoring the quality of domestic production of fortified foods. This means that our proposed system is not appropriate for countries where the majority of the fortified foods are imported. For such cases, a different enforcement system would be required. The objective of the enforcement system is to permanently monitor industry's compliance with fortification standards in nearly real time and based on data routinely collected by the industry. The goal of this system is to enforce the production of high-quality fortified foods to ensure that fortification programs can make meaningful contribution to increasing micronutrient intake at the population level. With a proposed enforcement system, we will be able to reduce progressively the uncertainty of large-scale food fortification programs' effectiveness as the system is adopted and adequately implemented in the countries over a certain period of time. Let's have a closer look to the indicator system. In this table, you can see the 5 proposed indicators labeled from A to E. In the first column, on the left, you will see the proposed indicator definition in its generic form. Next, moving to the right, an example of the metric is presented. For instance, for indicator A, which is monthly production of food vehicle, you will find the amount of food vehicle produced measured in metric tons. Moving to the next row, you will find indicator B, which refers to the amount of premix used. Moving to the right, in the third column, you will find the data source. For indicator A, the source is the production records from the staple factory. For indicator B, the data source is the premix storage logs. For the indicators C and D, there is no data source. This is because these indicators are calculated with the previous data. For indicator E, the source is the lab report containing the test results of the food samples. The results will indicate the average and variation of micronutrient concentrations measured in composite samples of the food vehicle. Now, please pause the video and take a moment to review all the indicators, their metrics, and the corresponding tools or data sources. In the next slide, we will demonstrate how we can utilize these indicators with practical examples. In this example, we use raw data from a flour mill to feed the indicator system. Indicator A from the former table is the monthly flour production of the mill measured in metric tons. In this case, 1,962 metric tons. Indicator B represents the amount of micronutrient premix used to fortify the flour produced in the month. In this case, 450 kg. With indicators A and B, we can calculate indicator C, which is the average premix addition rate. That is the amount of premix that needs to be added in grams per metric ton of flour. To calculate indicator C, we need the following formula. As you can see, the first thing we need to do is transform the premix used to fortify the flour from kgs into grams. Therefore, we multiply 450 kg by 1000, which gives 450,000 grams of premix. Next, we divide the result above by the amount of flour produced in the month in metric tons, which is 1962. Our last step consists of dividing the 450,000 grams of premix used to fortify the 1962 metric tons of flour produced to obtain the average addition rate, which is 229.4 grams of premix per metric ton of flour. This is the amount of premix that needs to be added to fortify the flour and reach the national standard in this specific mill. This indicator is used to assess if the appropriate quantities of premix are being utilized to fortify the flour. Once we have calculated the average addition rate, we can calculate indicator D. That is the addition rate as percentage of the target. To calculate this indicator, we need the target addition rate or TAR. The target addition rate is a value provided by the premix manufacturer, and it is used to meet the desired level of fortification. That is, the amount determined by the National Fortification Standard. In our example, the target addition rate is 250 grams of premix per metric ton of flour. The formula to calculate this indicator is as follows. You can see here that D equals the value of indicator C, which is 229.4 grams, divided by the target addition rate, which is 250 grams. Then we multiply this value by 100 to get the result in percentage. For our example, the result of this calculation is 92%, which suggests a good mill compliance. This indicator can be used to measure the percentage of the target being achieved at different levels. First, when applied to more than one meal, it shows how well each meal is meeting its target every month. Second, it can also show the average performance of all meals over a certain period of time. This is typically 1 month. Third, data from all meals can be aggregated to provide an overall view of compliance at the national level. Our last indicator is indicator E. It is used to measure the micronutrient content in food samples to objectively assess compliance with fortification standards. Here, we are interested on identifying the average micronutrient content and its variation on a set of composite samples. To construct this indicator, food samples must be collected at the production site. You learned how to collect the food samples to monitor compliance with fortification standards when following our rice and flour modules. However, to refresh your memory, we will quickly review the process in the next slides. As you may remember, composite samples must be prepared to assess the industry's compliance with fortification standards. The composite samples must be collected at 3 different places: the production line, the warehouse, and the inventory. A similar method is used for the 3 sites. The inspector removes 250-gram single samples of a food vehicle, for example, flour or rice, from the 3 sites. When collecting the samples at the production line, it should be at the end of the production line. The inspector collects food samples every 10 minutes until she has collected at least 5 single samples of 250 grams each. From the warehouse, the inspector collects the single samples from 5 randomly selected containers, for example, rice or flour sacks. From the inventory, the inspector prepares 3 composite samples. Hence, single samples from 15 different containers should be randomly collected. In most countries, a qualitative iron spot test is used to determine if a food vehicle is indeed fortified. For the iron spot test, 100 grams from each 250 gram single sample is taken. The inspector should conduct the iron spot test while the mill's quality control manager observes. If all 5 single samples of 150 grams each taken for the qualitative test are positive, we can assume that the samples are fortified. The remaining 150 gram samples are kept to prepare composite samples. Here is a quick overview of how to prepare the composite samples. Once we have 5 samples of 150 grams each, we need to combine these samples into a single composite sample of 750 grams. Remember that we need to prepare 1 composite sample from the production line, 1 from the warehouse, and 3 from the inventory. Hence, we will end up with 5 composite samples. Once we have collected the composite samples at the 3 sites, we need to split them into 2 samples. One is kept as reference, and the other is sent to the laboratory for quantitative analysis. The samples collected at the production line are indicative of fortification quality on the day of production. The samples collected at the warehouse and the inventory are indicative of fortification quality over time. These procedures should be replicated per food vehicle, factory, and brand. For now, the goal of these slides is to give you an overview of how the sample collection works. When implementing this system, you will have a manual with a step-by-step explanation about how to collect, store, and transport the samples. To reduce the inspection burden, we propose to conduct an unannounced inspection only once or twice a year. To implement the proposed system, we offer a comprehensive technical assistance package to transition from the current enforcement system to the new system. The technical assistance package will have 5 components. The online training modules on enforcement practices, inspection and auditing of flour and rice fortification, which you already know, a regional training workshop for WFP and food control authorities focused on the 5-indicator enforcement system, the enforcement system implementation manuals and tools, an implementation plan template to roll out the enforcement system, and all these will be complemented with on-site missions and remote sessions to support the effective implementation of our proposed system. The last component will be an evidence generation package. This will focus on testing the 5-indicator system we are proposing, the methods for data collection, the indicator metrics as well, and the tools for data collection and analysis. We will also investigate the barriers and enablers that may emerge among food control authorities and other potential stakeholders to use the proposed system in 1 or 2 countries. With this technical assistance package, we hope to be able to create a robust enforcement system that actually works in the countries and that can answer the question of whether the food vehicles are being adequately fortified. Now I'm going to refer to some considerations for the proposed enforcement system. It should be noted that this system is suitable for countries with substantial domestic production of fortified and fortifiable food vehicles. That means that importation of competing food vehicles should be minimal. For example, less than 15%. For countries with significant imports of similar food vehicles, commercial and import enforcement are required. In this case, our proposed system is not applicable for these countries. So that was it about the enforcement system. But before closing this presentation, I want to give you an overview of the proposed evaluation system so you can have a complete understanding of how we propose to address the crucial information gaps that I referred to at the beginning of this presentation. In this table, we can see the list of indicators on the left, the metric or the explanation on how to calculate the indicators in the middle, and the data source to the right. Indicator A permits to estimate the coverage of fortified foods. In other words, the proportion of the population that consumes the fortified foods. Indicator B gives information on the average consumption of fortified foods. The indicator C provides information on the average micronutrient intake resulting from indicator B. Indicator C is fed with data from the indicator E from the proposed enforcement system. That is, the average micronutrient content from the composite samples. Lastly, we have indicator D, which provides data on the contribution of micronutrient intake from the fortified foods relative to the micronutrient EAR. The micronutrient EAR is the FAO and WHO reference intake value that is used to estimate adequate and inadequate micronutrient intakes. This indicator will also help us visualize the proportion of the population who shifts their nutrient intake from inadequate to adequate, thanks to the consumption of fortified foods, as shown in the next slide. This graph visualizes how an effective food fortification program that achieves a meaningful intake of essential micronutrients can shift the current population distribution of micronutrient intakes towards adequate intakes. We will learn more about this system next year. For now, the purpose is to give you a sense of the goal of implementing both the enforcement and evaluation system. This is the end of this presentation. Thank you very much for watching it, and we hope to see you soon in the training workshop.